Good evening. Good afternoon, sorry. It's like the evening over here with all these bright lights. I do apologize. Our speaker today has probably got one of the most difficult jobs in Japan. I think it wouldn't be an understatement to say that. Japan's nuclear industry is going through the worst crisis of its history, its 50-year history. At the same time, the Fukushima nuclear plant situation gets worse and worse. In a few days' time, the last of the country's nuclear reactors are going to go idle, and pressure is building to restart them. The man at the center of all this is Dr. Shunichi Tanaka, and he's going to speak to us today. He's going to make a short presentation, and then we'll open the floor to questions. And our venerable Takamatsu-san is our interpreter. Okay, I'll hand it over to Tanaka Sensei.
ご紹介いただきました原子力規制委員会委員長の田中でございます。今日はお招きいただきありがとうございます。皆さんご承知の通り、当委員会は発電用原子炉に対する新しい規制基準を策定し、この7月8日からこの基準の下での審査をスタートしました。現在、申請のあった複数の原子力発電所について、公開で審査を進めています。
Hello, I've just been introduced. My name is Shunichi Tanaka. I am the chairman of the Nuclear Regulation Authority. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak before you today. As you know, the Nuclear Regulation Authority has recently established new regulatory standards for commercial nuclear reactors, meaning reactors that are to provide electricity power generation. And from July 8th, we are beginning new examinations or inspections based on these new regulation requirements. In fact, several companies have submitted applications to start their reactors, and we are in the process of conducting open hearings, open examinations of these applications.
今日は本来であれば、この新しい規制基準の内容を説明する予定でしたけれども、急遽内容を変更して皆さんのご関心が高いというか、国際社会にも大変ご心配をかけている福島第一原子力発電所の汚染水の問題に焦点を絞ってお話しさせていただきたいと思います。
As a result of this, today I had originally intended to speak to you in detail about some of these new regulatory requirements. However, I have decided to suddenly change the contents of my speech because I would like to focus on the topic that is probably of most interest to many of you, and the topic that is causing great anxiety to the international community. In other words, the problem of the contaminated or tainted water at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
東京電力福島第一原子力発電所は現在も不安定な状態にあります。事故直後は全く事態も把握できないという段階にありましたけれども、現在はそうした段階から、例えば今回問題になっております中水、冷却水、こういった汚染水について、まだ十分に解決していないということですので、事故は収束した段階ではないというふうに認識しております。敷地内での瓦礫一つを動かすにしても、通常の発電所とは全く違ったリスクが伴うわけでございます。
As you know, the situation with the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant is that the situation is unstable. Of course, we have been able to extricate ourselves from the terrible situation immediately following the accident, when we could not grasp what was happening. We could not fully comprehend what was happening at the plant. But as you know, the situation cannot be considered to have been resolved because we do have ongoing problems, including, of course, this contaminated or tainted water problem.
原子力規制委員会はこの1福島第一原子力発電所を特定原子力施設として法律的に指定しまして、法的な根拠に基づいてその安全を確保するために 取り組みを始めています。今後、第一発電所は廃止措置に向けてさまざまな取り組みを行ってまいりますけれども、その安全を監視していくというのが私たちの立場です。で、これまでは事故後からは、応急措置として行われてきた作業について、今後は原子炉規制法の中の特定原子力施設としての法的裏付けをもって規制できるようになったという意味を持っています。
Of course, the situation in Fukushima is very, very serious. It's very, very different from other nuclear power facilities. For example, moving even just one piece of debris in Fukushima means that you incur risks that are unimaginable at other ordinary nuclear power plants. As a result, the authority has designated the first or ground floor of the facility as what we call in Japanese specified nuclear power facility. It has been given a special designation, and we have also last month approved an implementation policy to begin the decommissioning of the reactor there. What I mean by this is that until now, different measures have been undertaken to deal with the situation in Fukushima, but they've all been sort of stopgap or emergency measures. But with the development of this new law, the nuclear regulation law, and with the establishment of our authority, we now have a legal framework or legal justification for issuing orders.
去る8月19日にいわゆる汚染水の仮設のタンクから線量の高い水が漏れまして、それが海に出た疑いがあることが判明しました。
As you may recall, on August 19th of this year, some very highly contaminated water seems to have leaked out of what we call the provisional or temporary tanks that were put into place. These tanks are very simply built tanks. They were just built by putting together steel plates. It has also become apparent that not only has water leaked from these tanks, but some water might actually have leaked into the ocean as well.
東京電力の推定によれば、漏れた汚染水の量は最大で300トンと言われています。タンクの下から長期間にわたって漏れていたという可能性もあります。ただ私どもとしてここで皆様に注意していただきたいと思うことは、漏れた量とか漏れた経路、またその原因についてはまだ推定の段階だということであります。現在一生懸命調査していますけれども、現在までのところ確実なことが分かったという状況ではありません。
According to Tepco's assessment, the amount of contaminated water that may have leaked into the ocean could be as high as or as large as 300 tons. And it is very possible that the water leaked from the bottom of the tank and that the water has been leaking from the tank for a very, very long time. However, I would like to take this opportunity to let you know that in regard to the amount of water that may have leaked, in regard to the path that the water may have taken to get to the ocean, and in regard to the actual reasons for the original leaks, all of this is still are things that we are still working on based on assumptions. We don't have clear confirmed facts for this yet.
漏れたかもしれないという可能性、この事実は大変深刻なことですけれども、タンクの水位すら測っていなかったというようなややルーズな管理であったということについて、私どもは注意を喚起するとともに厳しい指導をする必要があるというふうに認識しています。
Of course, the possibility that water may have leaked from the tanks is a very, very serious issue indeed. But separately from this, we believe that the management or the monitoring of the tanks represents a very, very serious issue as well. In other words, the fact that the water levels in the tanks were not monitored on a regular basis or were not even actually measured on a regular basis is an indication that the management was not done in a very stringent way at all. As a result, we have taken very strict measures and have used very strict instructions in asking Tepco to correct their current system.
この タンクからの漏洩については、とりあえずですが、INS の基準レベル3とする通報を行いました。実はこの評価をいくつにするかということについては悩んだところです。INS はいわゆる推進は通常のサイトで事故が起こった場合のことを想定しています。しかし、この福島原子力発電所は、レベル7の事故を起こした状態であり、今、その廃止措置安定化に向けた取り組みをしているので、この過程でのこういった事象をそのままの尺度で当てはまることが適当かどうかという議論がありました。そこで INS の適用と評価の取り扱いについて IAEA に確認した上で、8月28日に一応 INS3 レベル3として通報を行いましたけれども、こういった運用については今後課題が残っているというふうに思っています。
As you may know, we issued a rating for to describe the severity of this leak. We gave it a rating of 3, level 3 on the INS scale. That's the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale. However, we struggled with the decision as to whether to use the INS scale for this to begin with, because as you know, this INES scale was originally designed for events or incidents that occurred at a regularly operated nuclear power plant. The Fukushima plant, of course, is not a regular or normal nuclear power plant at all. It already has been designated as a level 7 accident site. So whether we should use the regular INES rating for this particular leak was something that we truly struggled with. Therefore, in regard to how to properly handle this rating, we contacted the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and based on our discussions with them on August 28th, we did issue the rating of level 3 for this leak. So that matter has ended. However, there are still some questions and issues that remain with applying this INES scale rating to Fukushima.
私としては一番大事なことは国際社会に適切な情報を適宜伝えることであろうと思っています。INS という形で伝える方法もありますけれども、今、福島の状況は、原子力発電所の状況は、日々いろんなことが起こって変わっているわけですので、こういった情報を丁寧に的確にIAEA を通して私どもから客観的な情報を提供するようにするということを、今規制庁の職員に対してもそういった取り組みをするようにという指示をしてきたところであります。
I would also like to mention that from a personal point of view, I feel what is most important in the work of the or one of the most important things for the work of the Nuclear Regulation Authority is to provide to the international community accurate, objective, and timely information. Of course, using the INES scale is one way to convey information, but as you know, the Fukushima situation is changing on a daily basis. There are many, many different issues and problems at the site. Therefore, in the future, we would like to continue to be able to offer, again, appropriate, accurate, and objective information through the IAEA on a very timely basis. I've tried to abide by this thinking myself, and I've instructed all of the staff members at the NRA to do the same.
私どもが心配した通り、この週末にも他のタンクの周辺でも比較的高い汚染が記録されています。複数のタンクや配管で漏洩が疑われているというような状況、現在の状況であります。今のところ、いわゆるタンク周囲の包みから外に出たという、汚染水が外に出たという形跡がないので、先に推定したような300トンもの漏れというような大規模な漏洩はないと思っていますけれども、いずれにしてもこういった心配がないように中の 汚染水、いわゆる漏れていると疑われる汚染水は他のタンクに移したり、配管の継ぎ目を点検したりして、今できるだけの対策を取っているところであります。
However, we've seen even over the weekend that some of our fears have come to realization or to be realized. In other words, we detected relatively high levels of radiation around similar tanks. In fact, there were many pipes and tanks that were under suspicion of perhaps producing leaks. At this point in time, however, we have not found any evidence that contaminated water has gotten outside of the little barriers that we have around the tanks. So right now, I do not think we have any other hidden situations where we have, again, 300 tons of contaminated water having leaked out and nobody having noticed. Having said all of this, however, considering the construction of these tanks, we must view everything with suspicion, and as a result, we have instructed the operator to move the contaminated water as quickly out of these problematic tanks as much as possible, and also to check all of the seams and joints for all of the tanks and for the pipes, and to make sure that everything that can be fastened is fastened very securely.
タンクの漏れがクローズアップされていますけれども、その前にもっと深刻な問題があります。それは地下水の汚染の問題です。5月から敷地内の観測口で高い濃度のトリチウムとストロンチウムが検出されていることが分かりました。時期を同じくして海岸近くのトリチウム濃度の上昇も見られています。汚染水が地下に漏れて、地下を通じて海に流れているというふうに推定しています。
Although we have now been paying a great deal of attention to the problem of the contaminated water leaking from the tanks, there is another problem that we have been highly concerned about for some time, and that is the problem of the contamination of groundwater within the premises. As you may know, from the end of May, we have detected high levels of tritium and strontium in the monitoring wells or the observation wells near the ocean side of the premises. And during the same period, we have seen in the seawater near the sea walls a rise in tritium levels.
現時点では漏れた汚染水による海洋の汚染状況はおおむね港の外に出ると検出限界以下、またはそれに、特段大きな変化もないという状況でありますが、こういった漏れているということ自体はこういう状況が続くことについては非常に深刻だというふうに捉えています。
We are assuming that the contaminated water has seeped underground and has traveled through the groundwater into the ocean. Having said this, however, at the present moment, we have been conducting seawater monitoring in the area around the plant, and most of the rise in radioactive levels of the water have been within the harbor or outside of the harbor area. The contamination levels are so low as to be almost undetectable. Having said this, however, we consider this kind of seepage to be a very serious problem.
こういった汚染水の問題の一番の源にあるのはタービン、いわゆる溶けた燃料を冷却している水と、それから事故によってトレンチという場所に溜まっている高濃度の汚染水ですので、これをいかに早く取り除くか、これをいかに隔離するかということが最も大事です。
In regard to the source of this contaminated water, as you may know, the primary source comes from water that has traveled through the turbine room. In other words, this is water that has actually touched the nuclear reactor. In other words, the melted nuclear reactor core. It has been used to cool the reactor core. Another place where there is a great deal of contaminated water with high radiation levels are in the trenches around the accident site. So the problem that is facing us is how fast we can remove this water, how fast we can contain this water.
この高濃度汚染水を除去する、あるいは隔離するということは、 大変技術的には大変難しい問題がありますので、こういった点については私ども規制委員会は規制という立場を超えて技術的科学的にこの取り組みをサポートしていきたいと考えています。
I mentioned earlier that our primary goal is to contain and to remove this tainted water. Having said this, however, this is a very, very technologically difficult thing to achieve, and therefore we at the Nuclear Regulation Authority have decided to go beyond our primary mandate, which is simply to regulate what is happening and to offer our technological and scientific advice to the operator.
春先にネズミが侵入して電気系統が故障してプールの冷却が止まるというトラブルもありました。
As you may remember, in the spring, a rat found its way into the premises and got caught in the electrical wiring, eventually causing a blackout. And as a result, the spent fuel pool cooling system went down for a while.
福島第一原子力発電所にはまだまださまざまなリスクがございます。その時にこういったリスクに対処する上で私どもが取っている方針はトータルのリスクをできるだけ下げると優先順位をつけて全体としてリスクを下げるということであります。特に敷地外の環境への影響を防ぐことが重要だと考えています。
As you know, we face many difficult challenges still at the Daiichi nuclear power plant site. There are many risks that are still there. The approach that we at the authority are taking is that we want to consider the overall comprehensive risk at the site, and we want to do our very best to be able to bring down the overall risk, comprehensive risk for the site. In other words, we put a priority list of matters to tend to first, and as a result, we lower the overall risk for the site. One of the areas that we put a tremendous priority on is to minimize the negative impact on areas outside the site.
例えば汚染水の問題であれば地下水の新たな流入を防ぎ汚染水の総量を増やさないようにしながら多角種除去装置アルプスって呼んでおりますけどこれを早期に動かしてすでにある汚染水に含まれる放射性物質をできるだけ減らすそして堅牢なタンクに保管するということであります。
In regard to ensuring that we do not bring negative effects to outside areas, one of the things that we are doing is to try to ensure that more water does not come into the system, and that we try to lower the radioactivity, the contamination levels of the tainted water. In order to do this, we would like to begin moving this new piece of equipment called ALPS, ALPS, which is a system, which is a piece of equipment that uses a system to remove radionuclides from contaminated water. We would like to begin these operations as quickly as possible, and once the radiation levels have been brought down, we want to be able to store this contaminated water in much sturdier tanks.
必要であれば基準値以下のものは海へ出すことも検討しなければならないかもしれません。
If it becomes absolutely necessary, we might possibly have to consider we might have to take into consideration the possibility that for tainted water, where the level of a contamination is below the acceptable limits or regulatory limits, some of this water might have to be discharged into the ocean.
私が先に基準値以下のものを海へ発言したことで一部で大変波紋を呼びました。しかし汚染水の問題を真剣に考えればそういう意味でございます。
I know that in the past I have made similar remarks. In other words, I have said that it might be, depending on the circumstances, that we will have to consider at one point possibly discharging tainted water, but tainted water that is, of course, tainted to levels below the regulatory limits. When I made remarks about that in the past, I know that this created a great stir in some circles. However, I would like to emphasize that I made these remarks precisely because I take the problem of the contaminated water so very seriously.
もちろん規制値、基準値を超えるようなものは出させません。それに基準値以下だと言っても風評被害っていうのは避けられないわけです。そこには何らかの手当が必要になると思います。こういったことを考えて、トータルのリスクを考えて、より大きな危険を避けるための判断をしていくということが、この深刻な状況を切り抜けるために不可欠だと考えています。
I would also like to clarify that I absolutely will not support the idea of discharging tainted water where the level of contamination is above the accepted limits. I absolutely will not accept this. And I also realize that even when we talk about discharging very low-level contaminated water, I realize that there are still negative effects that may arise based on different rumors that may come from such an incident. In other words, I think measures need to be put into place that will counteract these possible negative rumors. But these are the kinds of things that we must consider in the future in order to make, because I think it is important for us to understand the need to make difficult judgments in order to avoid larger problems in the future.
規制委員会は、本来の役割としては事業者の行うさまざまな取り組みを監視するという立場にあります。その意味で私どもがさまざまなそういった積極的な取り組みをするということについては少し慎重でかつなんかよく少し十分に考えておかなければいけないことがございます。
In other words, our primary goal is to reduce the overall risk from the site. As you know, the Nuclear Regulation Authority's primary stance is, or mandate is to oversee the work on restoring the site. We are, of course, being very active in this regard. However, even as we fulfill our duties, there are things that we must be very cautious about, that we must think carefully about.
しかし、事態の深刻さを考慮しまして、私どもとしては、まず汚染水を具体的にどういうふうにする対策を取るべきかというワーキンググループ、さらに、汚染した水、汚染水が環境にどのような影響を与えているかということをウォッチングする海洋モニタリングチームを発足させて今その取り組みを始めています。
In other words, although our primary function is to oversee these activities, we realize that the severity of the accident means that we must, in some cases, take a more active role. As a result of this, we have put together a working group to develop countermeasures for dealing with this issue of contaminated water. And again, in relation to this contaminated water, we have put together a group that we call the Maritime Monitoring Committee, and its primary function is to monitor what kind of effect this contaminated water might have on the surrounding environment.
福島第一の原発事故は、日本人と原子力に長く携わってきたものとしては、国際社会に大変なご迷惑をかけたということを十分に反省しています。
In regard to this Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, as a person involved in the regulatory activities in this country, as a Japanese person, actually, I know what kind of great anxieties and inconveniences would be a direct translation. We have caused the members of the international community. I'm very aware of the severity of the situation.
今回の汚染水の問題に限らず、これからも福島第一は今後30年、40年と最終的な廃止措置が終わるまで時間がかかります。
Not only are we dealing with the issue of the contaminated water, but when we consider the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in its entirety, we know that we have a long road ahead of us. In other words, it will be 30 to 40 years before the reactors can be fully decommissioned.
私どもとしては皆様の力をお借りして世界に正確な情報を適切に発信していくよう努力したいと思います。
What I am dedicating my efforts to achieving is to, as I mentioned earlier, convey with your help and your assistance to convey to the international community accurate information in a proper way, in a timely manner.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for having to rush you a bit there. Let me quickly say, please make sure your mobiles are turned off. I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier. We don't have a lot of time. We have a lot of people queuing up for questions. So one question each. Please, no speeches. Approach the microphone and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, David McNeil, freelance. 300 tons of water seems like a lot to miss. And we hear that there was a very small crew of people monitoring the tanks, and that now Tepco is scrambling to find people, qualified people who can monitor those tanks. All of that seems like a failure of regulatory oversight by your organization. My question is, would you accept that? A related question, I know we're only allowed one, but a related question is, we also hear that the people who are being employed to monitor those tanks are being paid the minimum wage. I've talked to one who alleges that. Do you think that's acceptable for such an important job?
その責任、私どもの責任をどう考えるかということですけれども、確かに国際社会、外の方から見れば、私どもも監督が十分でなかったという責任はあるかと思いますが、そのことについてはここで言い訳をするつもりはありません。
In regard to your first question about who the responsibility for these incidents occurring, in other words, I can understand that from someone looking into Japan from the outside, there can be a criticism that we, as the regulatory or overseeing authority, perhaps was not doing our work sufficiently well enough. I understand that there could be such criticism, but I am not here today to comment on such matters.
それからそういったものを監視する従業員の質の問題だと思いますが、これについては正直言って不十分だということは私も先の委員会で申し上げています。
In regard to your other point, which is that there may be a problem with the quality or the capabilities of the staff that is engaged in actually monitoring parts of the site. I also agree that with many criticisms that the quality level is not adequate enough, and this is something that I have mentioned in the past in committee meetings.
少し行き過ぎになるかもしれませんけれども、そういう意味で監視のやり方、細かい技術的な方法まで含めてある程度私たちが助言をしてそれを実行に移させていくという取り組みも必要かなというふうに今考えています。
Perhaps this is perhaps a comment that goes further than perhaps I would normally say, and perhaps that is actually appropriate. But although our fundamental mandate is to oversee or monitor, it may be that we should in future take into consideration the possibility that we are actually perhaps. Excuse me, the interpreter would like to start again, that in regard to the way that we oversee or monitor the situation, perhaps that could mean in the future that we would actually offer specific advice, including offering technical advice and offering instruction as to how to actually implement some of these measures.
でちょっと私の方からぜひ正確にお伝えしたいなと思いますのは、先ほども申し上げましたけれども、その汚染水による、汚染は環境、海の方には出ていないということを、特に今そういう出ているような状況ではないということをぜひお伝えしたいと思います。
I would also like to take this opportunity to repeat something that I said earlier, but I want to make sure that it is accurately conveyed. When we talk about the contaminated water leaking into the environment, specifically leaking into the ocean, as I mentioned earlier, high levels, levels beyond the acceptable limits of contaminated water are not being leaked into the environment, into the seawater.
将来まで汚染しないかどうかということは今の段階で保証できませんので、それについては先ほど申し上げましたように十分にウォッチしていきたいと思います。
Having said this, however, I would also like to clarify I am not guaranteeing that in the future higher or serious levels of contaminated water might possibly in the future be released. As a result, we are conducting very stringent monitoring of these radiation levels.
Thank you. My name is Khaldun Azhari, Pan Orient News. Would you be willing to accept international observers in your committee after September 8, the date of voting for Olympic Games or World Cup? I'm not sure. Sorry.
その規制庁の中に外国人のオブザーバーを入れるということを、すみません、外国人のオブザーバーを規制庁の中に据えるということを考えられますでしょうか。特に9月8日でございますでしょうか。オリンピックに向けてということでもございますが。
すでに私どもは世界を代表する規制の専門家3人にアメリカとイギリスとフランスのから3人のアドバイザーを指名してさまざまな意味で助言をいただいてまして、今までも何回か直接会ってますし、メール等でいろんなことをやり取りしています。
We already actually have 3 persons who are considered experts, world-class experts in this field to provide us with advice and comments. They are persons from the UK, the United States, and France. I have met them several times already, and we exchange emails on a frequent basis.
Peter.
Langen at Bloomberg News. The New York Times released a story in January of this year, January 10th, where a reporter had gone to Fukushima and interviewed different officials about the cleanup in the area and why overseas expertise was not being used. The official interview was Hideko Nishiyama, Deputy Director of the Environment Ministry, who said, quote, "Even if a method works overseas, the soil in Japan is different," end quote. And second quote, "If we have foreigners roaming around Fukushima, they might scare the old grandmas and granddads there." I'd just like to know, is that view representative of the Japanese government? And does it represent your view? And related question, in the water issue and release of water, you said earlier that you will consider very carefully before allowing this to happen. But isn't it a fact that you have no choice? You can either dump that water in the ocean after you process it, or you evaporate it. It's not a choice. Thank you.
はい。よろしいでしょうか。はい。すみません。ニューヨークタイムズの1月の記事だったわけでございますが、この記者が福島の方に行きまして、担当者とインタビューをしたそうでございます。でその時に話された方が西山副ディレクターというようなタイトルだったと思うんでございますが、その時になぜもっと外国の専門家を入れないのかというお話、質問を投げかけたところ、この西山氏が答えたのは、やはり外国で あるその処理方法が成功したとしましても、日本でそれがうまくいくっていう保証はない。なぜならば日本の土壌が外国の土壌と違う、という答えが出たそうでございます。そしてまた、外国、の方はあまり歓迎しないというもう一つの理由として、外国人が、この福島、の中をうろうろしてましたら、田舎のそのおじいちゃんおばあちゃんが非常にびっくりするのではないかというようなことを言われたそうでございます。このようなコメントが出たそうでございますが、これは田中様委員長のその見解でもありますでしょうか、また政府の考え方でしょうか。そして関連している質問でございますが、先ほどその汚染水を海に放出するかもしれない。しかしながらその時には慎重に考えて、また非常にその汚染レベルを低いものにするというふうにおっしゃったんでございますが、実際にはいずれそれを放出しなくてはいけないということになるのではないでしょうか。つまり汚染水が溜まってしまいますと、それを蒸発させるか海に放出する、この2つのその可能性しかないんではないでしょうか。実際にその検討するとかよく考えた上でやるとおっしゃったんでございますが、実際にはもう本当にオプションはないということではないのでしょうか。
外国の協力を売るということについて、それはさまざまな具体的なイシューが出てきたときに適にそれをやっていけばいいと思っています。それで例えば今でも汚染水の原子炉の中の汚染水からセシウムを取るということについては、当初からアレバとキュリオン社の協力を得たんですが、今アレバのやつは動かなくなってキュリオンと東芝のやつで今処理しています。で今後もさまざまな問題が出ると思いますけれども、そういったことについては適宜外国の協力を得ることによって解決がうまくいくならそういうふうにすべきだと思いますし、一概に外国の協力を得ることが大事なのか、それよりは問題を解決するために外国の知恵を借りる、そういう視点が大事だと私は思っています。
In regard to cooperation from non-Japanese organizations or companies or governments, I believe that what is important is that we look at specific issues as they arise, and then we consider what would be the best way to solve those issues. To be more specific, for example, in regard to the contaminated water issues, for the decontamination of water which had gone through the reactor core, in other words, the process to remove cesium from this contaminated water. Originally, we were using a process developed by Areva of France, and we were using equipment from Areva. However, that equipment eventually began to no longer move or to function. So at present, we are using processes and equipment by Toshiba and Kurion. And I believe in the future, as specific issues and problems arise, we should make a decision as to what is the best way to resolve this issue. And of those, when we consider how best to resolve an issue, we should consider all options, including cooperation with non-Japanese organizations and companies. In other words, I don't think the first priority should be we should decide on foreign cooperation or not, but rather we should decide on what is the best way to deal with a particular issue.
汚染水を海に捨てるしかないのではないかということですが、もちろん先ほども申し上げましたけれども、捨てる前には放射能の濃度が基準値以下になるように処理します。ALPS という装置で処理する予定です。で現在それで処理して十分に低くならないのがトリチウムです。トリチウム水はそれで処理できません。それは何らかの方法で希釈するなり何なりして放出することになろうかと思います。ただ私が自分で計算したんですけれども、昨年1年間で東京電力はだいたい20兆ベクレルから40兆ベクレルのトリチウムが外に出たというふうに発表しました。で20兆ベクレルっていうととてつもない大きな値だなというふうに思うんですが、私はトリチウム水として見た場合どれくらいになるかなと思って計算しました。最大でだいたい35グラムぐらいです。ですから単位っていうのとかその量的な理解をきちっとしないと非常にそういった点で誤った判断があると思います。 だからいいと言ってることではありませんけれども、そういうものだということもぜひ皆さんご理解いただきたいと思います。
In regard to your second point, your question as to whether we really basically had no choice but to release the contaminated water into the ocean, as I mentioned earlier, if we do decide to discharge tainted water into the ocean, into the environment, as I said before, we will make every effort to ensure that the contamination levels, the radiation levels, are below the accepted limits. And one way that we can achieve this is, as I mentioned before, to use the ALPS system, ALPS system, or equipment which does remove many of these radioactive elements. The problem, however, remains that ALPS cannot cannot lower the levels of tritium in the contaminated water. So some other process needs to be brought in to deal with the remaining tritium in the water. We are considering different measures in the future, for example, by somehow diluting the concentrations of tritium in the water. But as we are mentioning this fact, I would like to point out to you that I have actually done some calculations on my own. And it has been announced by Tepco that from 20 trillion becquerels to 40 trillion becquerels of tritium was released into the environment over the past year from Fukushima. When you hear figures such as 20 trillion becquerels, it sounds like an enormous amount. But I have done the calculations, and what that actually means in terms of quantity of tritium means that it's equivalent to about 35 grams of tritium. I'm not by any means trying to belittle the issue or saying that it is okay to discharge this amount. But I do want to ask that when one describes the situation, that one describes it accurately. The unit of measurement, the numbers that are used quite often can lead to misunderstandings. Again, I do not belittle the situation, but I would like to explain that it can be described in a different way as well.
Okay, Murray, I will try to get to everyone.
Hello, Mari Saito from Reuters. I wanted to ask you about your enforcement capabilities. I know that the NRA inspectors have told Tepco to improve monitoring and to improve record keeping and to do proper patrols of the tanks. Prior to this accident, they were not able to do it, and now you have a leak of 300 tons. What enforcement power do you actually have, and how can you be sure that Tepco will listen to your inspectors' advice and take your technological advice from now on?
ロイターズの斉藤と申します。その規制庁でございますが、どのくらいのその強制力というものを有していらっしゃるんでしょうか。つまり今回のその事象が起こる前に、規制庁の方では委員会の方ではTepcoの方にそのモニタリングを強化するように指示されたと思います。もっとパトロールを増やすようにって指示されたと思うんですが、それが実際に行われなかった、あるいは不十分だったという結果になってしまったわけでございます。実際にその指示を出すということはできると思うんでございますが、それを実際にその強制的なものにどのくらいのその強制力があるんでしょうか、その指示は。
いくつか口頭も含めましていくつかの指摘をしていたわけですが、それが十分に守られていなかったということは大変遺憾なことだと思っています。ただ先ほど申し上げましたように、今度は特定原子力施設として法律に基づいた許可というか指導ができるようになりましたので、今後はそういった法律に基づいた強制力を持って必要なことをきちっと守らせるというか実行させるということをやっていきたいと思います。
As you have mentioned, before these current incidents occurred, we did provide instructions and make comments and bring problems to light, both orally and through other means to Tepco. However, the instructions that we gave were not fully followed, and that I think is a very regrettable and not a permissible situation. But as I mentioned before, the Nuclear Regulation Authority now has been empowered with more legal sort of clout, as it were, by the fact that we have been able to designate the first floor area as a specially designated nuclear facility. As a result, we now do have the legal power to ensure that our instructions are followed. In other words, we do have enforcement rights now.
Can I ask, are you going to use them? Have you used these rights at all?
このような強制力、そういう権限はあるというような話をされているのでございますが、今までもそれを実際に使ったことはあるんでしょうか。そしてまた、今後もそういうふうにそのような権限を行使するっていうのか使う、おつもりはあるんでしょうか。
法的な強制力を発揮するっていうか発動するっていうことはある意味じゃ非常にビューロクラティックには簡単なことですけれども、実際に必要なことは福島の今の状況のリスクを顕在化させない、できるだけリスクを低減化させるという視点からどういうふうにするのが一番いいのかということについてはただ機械的に法的な強制力を持って指導するということではないと思っています。そういう意味で少し私どもとしてエキスパティーズを踏まえてもっと積極的に一歩二歩前向きにその指導とその助言を合わせながらやっていきたいと、そんなふうに思っています。
In regard to the word enforcement, which the interpreter is translating as kyosei, which means to actually use force, because we do now have this legal foundation, the idea of being able to actually use these enforcement capabilities or rights, it sounds very logical and simple in terms from a bureaucratic point of view, but this is a very, very delicate and difficult situation, and what is truly necessary is to ensure, first of all, that the inherent risks in the situation do not materialize, and as I've said repeatedly, somehow bring down the overall risk for the site. And in order to achieve this, it is not simply necessarily that we issue instructions and then if they are not exactly followed, we immediately somehow use our enforcement rights in a very mechanical or automatic way. What is necessary is that we use our expertise and perhaps take a more proactive approach in not offering guidance, but also offering advice as well.
Tanaka Sensei has agreed to stay a little bit later than scheduled, so I will really try and get to everyone. I'm going to give the floor to this lady over here, and I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to come back over this way.
Tamsin Booth from The Economist. You've been harshly critical of the operator. You said earlier this year that it seemed to have no sense of crisis at all. It's incomprehensible, I think, to a lot of the outside world that, for instance, there were no gauges on the water tank, so that it was impossible even to measure the amount of water that had leaked out. I'd really like to know what you think accounts for the mishandling in this manner. Was it lack of money, shortage of money? Was it that Tepco just didn't think it was an important subject? It didn't matter so much. Or was it that they're too focused on restarting reactors elsewhere?
エコノミスト、知りございます。以前にも、田中委員長は東電を非常に厳しく批判されていると思います。全く危機意識を持ってなかったというようなコメントをされていると思うんでございます。外国の我々から見ますと、東電の動き、体制については非常に理解できない部分があるわけでございます。例えばタンクに水位計というんでしょうか、水位を測るような装置もついてなかったということは非常に理解できないことなのでございますが、どうして東電はこのような体制になっていると思いますでしょうか。つまり、資金の問題なんでしょうか、もうお金がないという問題なんでしょうか、それとも東電の方ではこれはそんなに重要な問題だというふうに認識してなかったと思いますでしょうか。あるいは他の原子炉の再稼働を重要視していたので、こういうところをあんまり見てなかったと思いますでしょうか。
東電の危機意識のなさっていうのがどうしてかって言われても、なかなか私自身もよくはコメントできないんですが、お金がなかったというよりは福島の状況というのは非常に何ていうんですかキューバしのぎみたいな対応をしてきていますので、さまざまな抜けがあったというふうに考えています。
Being asked why I think Tepco lacks a sense of crisis, it's something that I really cannot answer because I have similar questions myself. You suggested the possibility that it was because Tepco lacked the money to deal with the situation. Rather than that, I think what the answer lies in the fact that the people in Fukushima at the plant have basically been dealing with the post-accident situation very haphazard responding with stopgap measures for the last several years. In other words, they've been met with a crisis, they've done their best to somehow get through that crisis, and it's always something comes up and they respond a kind of action that has been taken. As a result, there have been many things that have been missing in terms of an overall plan.
先に停電の問題があったり、今回汚染の問題があったりしてますけれども、今後ともさまざまなことが起こりうるという状況にあります。したがって私どもとしても、東京電力に対してもそういうふうに伝えたいと思いますが、できるだけそういったリスク、潜在的なリスクを予測して、それに早めに手を打つと。遅れることのないように手を打っていくということが最も大事だと思っています。改めて今そんなふうに認識しているところです。
As you know, Tepco has been faced with several problems even just in this past year. They have had electrical outages. They have had this problem with contaminated water leakage. And as I mentioned earlier, I believe that in the future, many other things will possibly come up as problems on this site. So what I've been saying repeatedly to Tepco, and I will continue to say this in a very strong way, is that what needs to be done is to identify the potential risks at the site as quickly as possible, to identify them and to develop ways to deal with those potential risks. In other words, to mitigate those potential risks before they become serious problems as quickly as possible. I've said this before, and I will continue to say so.
Hi, I'm Daniel Leusink. I'm a freelance correspondent for Het Financiële Dagblad, the financial paper from Holland. And I've been in Tokyo. I've been based in Japan since 2007. How will you make sure the government and Tepco ensure the safety of the power plant workers who have to check, repair and clean up these water leaks at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant?
オランダのその金融新聞でございます。2007年から日本に駐在しております。原発の作業をしているその作業員のその健康をどのように政府あるいはその東電が今後担保いたしますのでしょうか。安全性と言っておりますが、健康と安全性両方でございますでしょうか。
作業員の健康といっても放射線の被曝ということについては線量計を持って外部被曝内部被曝を含めてコントロールしていくということが基本になっています。それはもちろん法律で決められた値を超えないようにするということが最大の義務になります。その他にも作業員の健康というのは、例えばこの暑い中での作業によるさまざまな健康の問題もあります。ですからそういったことについては私どもの所掌ではありませんけれども、いわゆる労働環境を良くしていくということは常に事業者、東京電力は常に考えていくべきことだと思っています。
When you talk about the health of the workers, if we are talking about the exposure to radiation, all of the workers are required to put on dosimeters, meters that record the radiation exposure levels. And this is for both external exposure and internal exposure as well. And the fundamental obligation of the operator is to ensure that the exposure levels do not exceed what is permitted by law. In regard to other health-related factors for the workers, when we consider the tremendously hot heat that we are facing, there are other elements that need to be taken into consideration to preserve the health of these workers. That is not something that is directly within our mandate, but certainly I believe that the operator, Tepco, has an obligation, a responsibility to ensure that the labor environment for the workers are maintained.
I'm Joël Lejean from RTL France. Thank you for your comments, Mr. Tanaka. We might argue with you that the quantity of things which are leaked into the water is not of a major danger. I mean, after all, we don't know if the water that touches the reactor hasn't leaked already into the ocean. And that is quite of a strange description that you're having today, because what you're saying basically is that you're going to oblige a whole region to be isolated from the rest of the world, if I understand well. So, first question is confirmation of the leakage. Does the water which touched the reactor has or not been leaked into the ocean? That's my question, first of all. Thank you.
はい、RTL、フランス放送でございます。コメントありがとうございます。先ほどその、汚染水がその、海にその放出された、それのその放射性物質の濃度のその解釈について、我々はちょっと違う考えを持っているかもしれません。ちょっと議論する余地があるかもしれません。つまり、実際にその原子炉に直接触った水が本当にその海水の方に流れてないかということはわからないんではないかということでございます。結局そういうことが可能性としてあったとしましたら、この地域全体が世界から隔離しなきゃいけないというような状況になってしまうかもしれません。で、その私の質問といたしましては、実際にその原子炉に触った水が海水に流れてないんでしょうか。
いわゆる汚染水の源は原子炉の燃料に触ったものですから、それがリークしているとすれば当然その原子炉から出ているものです。ただ時間も経ちましたし、いろんなことで環境の測定もいろいろやってますと、大体各種としてはセシウム137、134、それからストロンチウム90、それにトリチウムというような各種に大体ほぼ絞られてきています。そういう意味で原子炉によってコンタミされた水だからどうこうっていう、もちろんそうでなければそういった確証は出ないわけですけれども、そういったものについて十分な監視をしていくということが大事だと思っています。
When we talk about contaminated water, basically we are talking about water that has actually touched the fuel within the nuclear reactor. That is why we refer to this as a contaminated water. And yes, it has leaked into part of it into the ocean. At the same time, however, we know that some time has passed since the water was originally contaminated, and we have been monitoring the contamination levels of the water around the site on a constant basis. We have been able to ascertain that over time most of the other radioactive elements, materials have dissipated or been removed. What is remaining are the nuclides cesium-137, cesium-134, strontium-90, and tritium. And these are nuclides that would not be existing in the water unless it had touched the reactor core. So yes, the contaminated water that has touched the nuclear reactor fuel core fuel has leaked into the environment, and therefore I believe, but we are monitoring their levels, and the levels are as I described, and we are continuing to monitor the levels of this water. We think it is very important to continue with the monitoring.
Gentleman at the back.
Hello, I'm Terry Jimbo with the videonews.com and one of the directors here at FCCJ. I have a question regarding the reactor number 4, the spent fuel pool in particular. I know that there's some 1,500 spent fuel rod on the 5th floor of a badly damaged building up there right now. And I know Tepco is planning to start removing those spent rod from November. So my question is, what is the potential risk there? Can we trust Tepco that they can safely remove those spent fuel? I know, as far as I know, it's never been done to remove a spent fuel rod of that much magnitude from a badly damaged building. So if I can, I'd like to hear what's the worst scenario we should be anticipating. Thank you.
神保と申します。このクラブのディレクターの一人でもあります。私の質問は、その原子炉4号についてということでございます。この具体的に申し上げますと、ここのその建物にあります使用済み燃料プールについてであります。我々の理解では、この使用済み燃料プールの中に約1500本のその燃料棒が入っているというふうに聞いております。で、このプールは5階に設置されたんですが、その建物そのものがかなりのひどい損傷を受けているということでございます。今の予定であれば、11月から東電はその使用済み燃料棒を少しずつその撤去する作業を始めるというふうになっているんですが、どのようなリスクがこの作業にありますでしょうか。そして安全な形で東電が問題なくそういうような燃料棒を全部撤去できると思われますでしょうか。我々は東電がそういうことをできるというふうに信頼できるんでしょうか。そして、私の、知っているところでは今までこのような崩壊されたというか損傷を受けた建物からこのような燃料棒を取り出すという作業は、世界でも例がないと思うのでございますが、我々は、ワーストシナリオ、最悪の場合はどのようなことが起こる、ことが、可能でしょうか。
建物は既存の建物は壊れました。クレーン等もなくなってますので、今新しくその燃料を取り出すための建物を作りまして、それができて間もなくその取り出し作業が始まります。ですから通常の普通の使用済み燃料のプールからの取り出しと同じような手順でやることになります。でそれについてのさまざまなその危険性というものについては十分にこれまで以上に注意深く配慮していくことが必要になると思いますが、基本的には今までにやっている作業と同じような作業になりますので、そのことで建物が壊れているというのは事実ですけれども、その建物に寄りかからない方法で、取り出すわけですので、十分安全は確保できるというふうに思っています。クレーン、ごめんなさい。
As you pointed out, yes, the building has been severely damaged, and as a result, the crane, which would normally be used in this removal process, does not exist right now. So what is being done at present is to create a new building and new facilities around the spent fuel pool, and once that is done, the work of removing the rods will begin. And the process that we will follow, the method that we will use, will be the normal process for removing spent fuel rods from a pool. Having said this, of course, we realize that we will have to pay even more diligent or stringent attention to this process to be prepared for any dangers that might arise. But again, the fundamental process is the process that is normally followed for removing rods from a pool. In other words, although the original building was broken, we are putting together a situation so that we will not have to rely on the broken building facilities.
I see everyone, don't worry. We've still got about half an hour.
Martin Kölling with the German financial daily Handelsblatt. I would like to refocus a little bit our focus and on the existing nuclear plants that are offline and are about to go online. One major question that you are facing with is, of course, the question of active faults below the reactor buildings. First, my questions are related to this issue. First, how it seems to be more art than science to determine whether a fault is active or not. I think even the scientists on your committees are divided on the assessment of what actually constitutes an active fault. How do you make sure that you get a very objective decision on this issue? And secondly, it seems this determination of active faults seems to be like determined by the look into the rear mirror whether there will be an earthquake just at the same place or a rupture in the future. How sure can you be by this determination that there is an active fault or not? Or let's say that there is no active fault, that there won't be an earthquake directly under a nuclear power plant.
ドイツのハンデルスブラッド新聞でございます。今既存の他のその原子炉について伺いたいと思います。他のその原発について伺いたいと思います。いくつか稼働しているものもあれば、ほとんどがオフライン稼働してないわけでございます。今規制委員会は非常に難しい問題に直面していると思うんです。一つ直面している問題といいますのは、各その原子力施設の下に活断層があるかどうかというのを決めなきゃいけないということを判断しなきゃいけないというわけでございます。今のその科学のレベルにおきましては、これは必ずしもその特定できないという問題があるように思います。つまりその委員会の中のメンバーの中でも、その活断層の定義そのものについて意見が分かれるというような状況があると思います。どうやって最終的に客観的なその判断というのが出せるんでしょうか。そしてそれに関連したものなんでございますが、もしその活断層の定義が決まったとして、例えばある施設におきましてはここには活断層がないという判断が出たとしても、将来的にここに地震が起こらないということをどうやってそれを確認することができるんでしょうか。予測できるんでしょうか。
少し込み入った説明になるかもしれませんけれども、いわゆる活断層があるかどうか、活断層もいろんなレベルがあるわけですが、非常に大きな活断層、中ぐらいの活断層っていうふうな、そういうところは大体我が国ではほとんど大体同定されていると思います。
The answer might be a little detailed, but I would like to explain, first of all, that when we talk about active faults and whether an active fault exists or not, first of all, we should talk about the fact that there are different kinds or different levels of active faults. In regard to large active faults, in regard to medium-sized active faults, there is fundamentally a basic agreement within the nation and experts as to what constitutes these active faults.
いわゆる原子炉建屋のような重要な施設のから少しでも距離の離れたところについては、そういった活断層が動いた場合の最大地震動を想定して、それに耐えられるかどうかということが一つのその地震に対する基準になっています。
As you know, at present, in regard to important facilities within a nuclear power plant site, for example, the building that houses the nuclear reactors, there are specific standards in place. For example, if you have an active fault, a specified distance from a nuclear facility, there are estimations, calculations made as to what could be the maximum degree of shaking of that facility if that active fault were to somehow move. And based on that predicted maximum level of shaking that you can foresee, does the facility, the building, etc., have enough resistance in the design to withstand such shaking? That is one of the fundamental basis for standards in building nuclear power plants.
ご指摘のように全ての活断層が分かるかということですが、実際に歴史的に見ると分からない、今まで考えられていなかったようなところでも地震が起こっています。
In regard to your question, are we able to have the ability to identify every single active fault in this country? When we look at the historical documents, we have seen that unfortunately that is not the case. In other words, there have been active faults discovered that were not predicted or not discovered previously.
そういった場合も想定して活断層を同定できないような場合の耐震性っていうものについてはそれも基準を決めています。今まで歴史的に我が国で歴史的にどういった最大の地震動が起こっているかっていうようなことを参考にして決めるわけです。
But even in those cases, we do have standards in place that take into account what the maximum amount of shaking could possibly be for a particular site, even if there is no active fault currently being identified in the vicinity. The way such calculations are made is that data is looked at based on the largest amount of shaking from earthquakes ever recorded in Japan, and as a result, a certain degree of resistance must be met by the facility if it is to be allowed to operate.
先の新しい規制基準もそうですが、以前からそうですが、いわゆる原子炉の重要施設の下に直下に活断層がある場合には、そういったことは認めないということになっています。現在そういったことについて具体的に言うと敦賀2号機についてそれの有無について私どもの専門家の評価ではあるという疑いは消えないということですが、事業者の方はないということを主張して今議論しております。いずれにしても原子炉の潜在的な危険性ということを考えると疑いがないということでなければやはり原子炉の稼働というのは難しいのだろうと思っています。
In regard to the new regulation standards that were issued by our authority, we do have very specific rules, and actually these are not new rules, they have been standards that already existed in Japan in the past, and that the fundamental rule is that for important buildings or important equipment, important facilities such as the building that houses a nuclear reactor, you cannot build such a building if there is an active fault directly underneath that building. In regard to this matter, we are actually in the process now of debating whether or not an active fault exists under an important building. Specifically, I'm talking about reactor number 2 at the Tsuruga nuclear power plant site. Our expert, one of our committee members, has said that he cannot rule out the possibility that there is an active fault beneath this reactor building, whereas the operator of the facility says that there is no active fault beneath that building. So we are now in the process of debating this issue. We are discussing it. But our fundamental feeling or our fundamental belief is that unless you can absolutely say that there is no risk or there is no potential risk of an active fault being beneath a building, that reactors should not be operated.
Right over at the back. Yes. No, sorry, the one behind. I'll come to you soon, sir.
Dennis Normile of Science magazine. I'd like to return to the issue of the long-term plan for dealing with the contaminated water. My colleague who asked the question previously, experts that we have spoken to, both myself and my colleagues in the US and Europe, say it will be very problematic to try and store vast quantities of contaminated water for the long term. They're saying that at some point you will either have to purify them as best you can, purify the water as best you can, and dump it or evaporate it. I understand that you're going to get as much of the contamination out as possible, but still, the experts we've talked to are saying that it's a choice of one or the other. Is your position different? Do you think you can store this water indefinitely? Second, you've referred to regulatory limits on the amount of contamination. Which limits are these exactly? I know there are regulatory limits on allowable contamination of drinking water. I think dumping contaminated water will be absolutely unprecedented. And are there any regulatory limits that apply to the deliberate discharge of contaminated water? And finally, since this probably is a very unprecedented case, before you discharge any contaminated water into the ocean, will you try to get, I don't know if permission is the right word, will you try to gain the understanding of the international community?
サイエンス AC 科学誌のノーマルと申します。汚染水の長期的な対応策について伺いたいと思うんです。先ほど私の同僚が質問をしましたし、また米国などの専門家の多くと話したわけなんでございますが、やはりいずれ放出、何らかの形で汚染水を放出しなくてはいけないのではないかという結論がおおむねでございます。と申しますのは、長期においてこういう汚染水をただ貯蔵するというのは非常に難しい、困難を伴うようなことだというふうに、専門家が言います。ですので最終的には、できるだけ除染の処理をして、そして最終的には残った汚染水を蒸発させるか、あるいは海などに放出する、その2つのオプションしかないんじゃないかという、ことになると思うんでございますが、どっちかをいずれ選択しなきゃいけないというふうに、多くの専門家が考えるんですが、委員長は、そうではないというふうにお考えでしょうか。つまり長期においてこの汚染水をただ貯蔵して、保管し続けることができると思いますでしょうか。そして先ほどから汚染水基準値以下というお言葉を使っているんでございますが、どのような基準値を指しているんでしょうか。つまり例えば飲料水について、基準というのがあると思うんでございますが、今まで例えばこういう汚染した水を、意図的に放出するっていうような例がなかったと思うんですが、どのような基準を考えているんでしょうか。そのような基準というのがあるんでしょうか。そしてまた万が一このように放出しなきゃいけないっていう段階になったとしましたら、許可という言葉なのか理解という言葉が分かりませんが、国際社会から理解を得るようにしたいとお考えでございますでしょうか。
処理した後、基準値っていうのはあるわけですが、後で説明しますけれども、それいかにピュリファイしてその後の水は保管するのではなくて、何らかの方法で捨てるように海に放水するとか排出するということは避けられないと思っています。ですからそれについてはですから先ほど来基準値以下になるまではアルプスとかそういった方法でとにかくピュリファイをしていくということです。それからいわゆる原子炉施設からの排水については国際的にもほぼ決まったような各種ごとの放出濃度というのがあります。でそれが基本になっています。ですから 今、汚染した水は出た試しはないという、今ご指摘がありましたけれども、もう世界中の原子力施設から何らかの形でそういったものは別に通常の場合でも出ています。ですからそういったことそれが基本として私どもはそれを崩すということではなくて、そのレベルまできちっとピュリファイするということであります。国際社会に対する説明っていうのは必要だと思いますが、そういったことでご説明してご理解をいただくということになるかと思います。今までも歴史的に見れば太平洋上で大気中の核実験も起こったし、いろんなことがあって、私が子どもの頃雨が降るときには帽子をかぶってでないと頭がはげちゃうよ、髪が抜けちゃうよと言われたぐらい、放射能のレベルは大気中の放射能のレベルは今より数万倍高かったというような時期もありますので、ぜひ今の私どもの取り組み、福島の事故の後始末についての精一杯の取り組みをしているんで、そういったことも踏まえてご理解いただきたいと思います。
In regard to your question, I will explain a little bit more detail about these legal limits in a few moments. However, our fundamental approach is to purify or remove as much of the contaminants from the water as possible. In other words, to bring the contamination levels to well below the acceptable limits. And then in the final analysis, we will have to, I believe we will eventually have to dispose of the water in some way, whether that will be in the ocean or some other way. We will have to eventually dispose of this water. Having said this, however, I would like to reiterate that we are committed to removing the radioactive materials, in other words, purifying the water using such methods and equipment as the ALPS system and others. In regard to removing low-level contaminated water that has been used in the for nuclear reactors, there are actual levels, there are specific limits that are used worldwide as to what level of contamination you can have in water that is released or discharged. You mentioned in your comment that you did not know of any precedent where contaminated water had been released into the environment, but in reality, this is something that all nuclear power facilities throughout the world do, even under normal conditions. And those are the criteria on which we will base our future activities. In other words, we're not trying to get a special exception or raise the approved limits. We would only discharge eventually water that is radioactive within the acceptable limits that are used throughout the world. In regard to your question as to whether we would try to gain the understanding of the international community, of course, we believe it is our responsibility to explain to the international community what we are doing and to gain their understanding. I would also like to point out that what is being discussed here is something that is not unprecedented in history. If you look at what was done in the Pacific waters in the past, for example, atomic testing that was done in the past, I remember as a child when I was growing up, when on rainy days I was instructed to always wear a hat, otherwise I would become bald eventually. I mean, the kind of radioactive materials, the amount of radioactive materials in the atmosphere at that time was several tens of thousands of times the amount that we are talking about today. So in regard to what we are attempting with all of our efforts to do in trying to resolve the situation after this terrible accident at Fukushima, we are hoping to be able to gain the understanding of the international community in this regard.
Okay, we still have a little bit more time over here, and then I'll come back over here.
Moto スイス大使の村田でございます。ある世界的に知られた物理学者から 私にコメントが寄せられました。日本の方ですが、福島の事故の教訓として、この 2年半経ってもこういう状態のことを経験した以上、日本は世界に向かって原発事故というものは電力会社一つの国家だけでは解決できないものであるということを発表すべきではないかという意見でございます。これをお伝えしたいと思いました。そしてもう一つは、ある事故調で非常に重要な役割を演じた方ですが、東電はすでに国有化されていると。それなのに事故処理体制が国が全責任を負う体制になっていないと。これはこの恥ずかしいことであるという見解でございます。そこで2つの緊急課題があると私は存じます。一つはこの総理を直括した事故対策本部を設置すること、もう一つは人類の英知を動員するための国際タスクフォースを設置することだと思いますが、いかがでございましょう。
My name is Murata. I recently heard a famous Japanese physicist say that the lesson of Fukushima is that since we are in a still dire situation 2.5 years after the accident, it is time now for the Japanese government to announce publicly that this accident is something that one single electric power company or one single nation cannot resolve on its own. There was also a comment made by one of the accident investigation committees that the point that was made that although Tepco is basically or in de facto a nationalized company, in spite of that, the Japanese government has not come forth and assumed total responsibility for resolving this accident, the situation, and that is something that the Japanese government should be very ashamed of. I think there are two things that immediately come to mind when we consider such things. One is that I believe that under the leadership of the Prime Minister himself, accident countermeasures headquarters office should be established immediately to deal with this situation. And secondly, that an international task force, which will represent the most brilliant minds and the best information and knowledge of the world, be created to deal with the situation. What do you think?
ご指摘のことは伺っておくという以外私の答えようがないんですが、私の立場から今のようなご指摘についてコメントする立場はないので、そういうことでご了解願いたいと思います。
The only thing that I can say publicly in response to your comments is that I will take your suggestions and your advice and your words into consideration. Please understand that given my current position, my current responsibilities, I cannot comment any further.
Person sitting next to Joel. Yes, you. And I'll come to you, Jake. I'll try and get to you. And I'll try and get to you as well.
AP 通信の山口です。よろしくお願いします。汚染水タンクからの漏洩についてちょっとお尋ねしたいんですけれども、最近漏れの可能性が相次いで報告されていますけれども、これは検査というか見回りを強化したせいで次々見つかっているのか、あるいはそろそろその対応年数が来てどれもこれも同じような状況で少し危なくなっているのかというそうであればもう次々同じようなことが至るところで起こるのではという心配があるんですけれども、もし最悪の場合はどのようなことが起こるとお考えでしょうか。それから一つのタンクで300トン漏れたというタンクに関しては前に置かれていた場所が地盤沈下してそこから移動させたという話がありましたけれども、そこの地盤が水漏れ検査中の重みで沈下したということ自体が基礎とかそのタンクの場所の耐震性地盤の問題にかなり懸念が生じると思いますけれども、そのあたりもし例えば今後地震が起こったりしたらどういうふうなことが考えられるか教えていただけたらと思います。 それからすみません、もう1点なんですけれども、写真で1800ミリシーベルト、すみません、漏れの1800ミリシーベルトの漏れがあったという線量について出ていましたけれども、この数字をどういうふうに理解すればいいのか、例えば4時間で致死に達するというふうな報道もありますけれども、そういう表現で良いのかどうかということがちょっと気になります。
So, in regard to the leaks that have been discovered from the tanks, we know we received many reports, but I would like clarification. How were these? Why were these leaks discovered? Was it because there was more emphasis put on strengthening the monitoring activities, and so these leaks were discovered, or was it that the natural limits, the durability of the equipment in question had just been reached, and therefore these leaks began? Because if it is the latter, it means that there's a possibility that we will experience more and more leaks in the future. What is the worst possible situation that you could envision? And the second question I have has to do with about 300 tons of water having leaked. And there seems to be some discussion about whether the ground underneath the tank sank in some way, and if so, can you comment about the way that the ground on which the tank was set was checked beforehand, and as to whether it could endure such weight? What kind of stance was in place in regard to this? And the third question has to do with about the figures that have been announced, that 1,800 millisieverts of contaminated high levels of water are leaked. How exactly can we understand these figures?
今回見つかっているのは、監視を強化したことによっていくつかのいわゆるホットスポット的な汚染っていうのが見つかっているということです。今先ほどまでの報告を聞いている限りにおいては、汚染水が有意な量大量に漏れたとか、そういうことではなくて、今そういう状況があるということです。ですから以前からそういうところが汚れていたのか、その後汚染が広がったのか、その辺についてはまだ分かりません。ただ汚染水漏れというほどのものではなくて、汚染があるいくつかの箇所でかなり高いレベルの汚染が見つかったと、こういう段階かと思います。それからご指摘の地盤が弱いのではないかということについて、かなり緊急的にそういったタンクの設置をするということで、十分なことがされているのかどうかというところまではチェックは進んでいますが、一応いわゆる専門の業者、土建業者がきちっと評価をして作っているわけですけれども、そういったところについては不安がありますので、できるだけ監視を強めて早期に大きな漏れがないうちにそういう兆候をつかんで対処するということが大事だというふうに思っています。それから1800ミリシーベルトパーアワーという値ですが、これは汚染を表現するものとしてミリシーベルトっていう単位は世界中でどこにも使えませんということを数週間前の委員会でも申し上げました。しかし東電はそう言ってるんですが、普通はベックレルパースケアセンチメートルとかベックレルパーリットルとか、そういう値で表すのが汚染です。ですからそういうものです。で1800ミリシーベルトっていうのを、これ仮にそうだとしても、これはベータ線です。ベータ線ですからほとんど透過力がありませんので、いわゆるガンマ線とかそういったものの空間線量とは全く意味が違います。ですからベータ線ですので、極端に言うとちょっとした5ミリから10ミリぐらいのプラスチックとか、あるいは革靴を履いてれば大体もう透過しませんので、その上に 少々立ってどうってことはありません。ですからその辺はこの線量で致死量に行くとかなんかっていう報道も見受けられますけれども、これは情報の発信の仕方が間違ってるというか適切でないということを再三申し上げてるんですが、なかなか治ってないというところがありますので、ぜひ皆さんにこういうことを申し上げるのは筋違いなんですけれども、ぜひ報道の方にもそこのところをぜひご理解いただいて正しい報道をしていただくようお願いしたいと思います。
In regard to being able to identify contamination in this time, it is because we did strengthen monitoring activities that the potentially problematic spots were discovered. Until now, we do not have any evidence that a great deal of contaminated water leaked. We just have been able to locate several places that have evidence where some contaminated water did leak. We do not know any further than that, except that we do know that there has not been the large-scale kind of leak that we had in the past. In regard to your question about the firmness of the ground underneath these tanks, certainly these tanks were erected in a very emergency sort of situation. They were erected very quickly, and whether or not enough advance work was done to ascertain whether the ground was firm enough, we have not yet been able to check that procedure in depth. Having said this, however, the tanks were erected by people or organizations or companies which have had experience. They are considered experts in this field. However, because this is something that gives us considerable anxiety, we are strengthening the monitoring activities to make sure that any potential problems are discovered quickly before they become a very major problem. In regard to your question about how we should interpret or understand the millisieverts figure, yes, what was announced was that 1800 millisieverts was the amount of radiation or levels that was in the contaminated waters. It was 1800 millisieverts per hour. That terminology, the word millisieverts, is not used anywhere in the world to describe a radiation exposure. This is something that I have pointed out repeatedly to the operator, and that I have mentioned publicly several weeks ago. Throughout the world, when you talk about radiation exposure, you use the term not millisieverts but becquerels. For example, how many becquerels per liter, how many becquerels per square inch, that kind of terminology. And even if the 800 millisieverts sounds like a great deal sounds like a frightening figure, I would like to point out that what we're talking about is beta emissions, so beta rays, which means they do not have the power to irradiate or go through bodies the way, for example, gamma rays do. In other words, if you wear some kind of protective thing, such as plastic that is maybe 5 millimeters or 10 millimeters thick, or if you wear leather shoes, you will not be irradiated. I mean, the rays will not go through you. It is not something that can lead to grave injury or even death, as has been suggested in some media reports. I do not so much blame the media as I think the fault lies in the fact that the way the information is presented, the unit of measurements, for example, is sometimes creates misunderstandings. This is something that I've repeatedly told Tepco to correct, yet it still seems to be something that they continue to do. I know that it seems odd to go past Tepco and ask you, members of the media, directly, but please look into these matters and please understand the correct terminology, and please make sure that accurate information is being conveyed.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up now. We've simply run out of time. Dr. Tanaka has run out of time. We thank you very much for coming to speak to us. I'm sorry, Jacob. We wish you all the best in this difficult endeavour, and it remains for me to give you a 1-year honorary membership of the FCCJ, and hopefully you'll come back again and speak to us at some point in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.